It is Tuesday, April 16th, 2019. I'm Justin Gary, interviewing Margaret Kibbee. In the room with us today is Roy DeBerry, Sierra Tucker, Cameron Levine, Caleb Hall, Morgan Cuderini, Jeannie Kilgore, Ryan Parrish, Dylan McCullough, and Ben Cole. Miss Margaret, so tell us, where are you from?
I'm from the Bay Area of California,
So how long were you in California?
from age 0 to 19, and then I came here. I came here with the 65 Civil Rights Project, 65 Summers Project, and I'm still here. So, in the time that I was here, I was working in the Sunflower County Delta, and we did a lot of things with voter registration, elections. We had the first election in Sunflower where we had a chance to elect a black office holder. We didn't get it, but anyway, we did a lot of different projects throughout my first half a decade in Sunflower County, and wound up being old enough to register to vote myself there. So I was still there. Eventually, it became obvious that I was going to have to figure out a way to make a living. So I worked briefly for Head Start, doing absolutely nothing. And then the person with whom I was still associated, I'm associated with his family. Anyway, Otis Brown Jr., who was my project director, had a legal problem, and we were represented by Alex Sanders, who was the project managing attorney in Greenwood. And so he did his case, and he talked to us, and he said, well, I'm going to need a support staff, another person who can help type and can help do other things and work with clients on welfare cases and some Social Security cases. And so at the beginning of that year, which was January 1970, I started working for Legal Services. And that was that. So one of the reasons I agreed to do this interview and to make it important and known that legal services like Delta Health Clinics or some of the health clinics in this state were an outgrowth of the civil rights movement. We had lawyers from New York and then local lawyers who were working hard to establish a support or to establish benefits for people in the community who never had these things. And so the Legal Services program started in Greenwood, Mississippi, and I started working in Greenwood. And eventually, finally, black law students started graduating from Ole Miss. Back in those days, they didn't have to take the bar exam. But anyway, Legal Services was about the first and only place they could get employed. So a lot of black attorneys got started in legal services, and eventually they wound up becoming judges and legislators and all this, but they got their start in legal services. And so legal services initially was connected pretty closely to community problems such as school integration, school desegregation, voter registration, and we did represented people in with divorces and those sort of things. I didn't do that, but I did do the Social Security disability and welfare. We had lots of welfare cases, and our way of training was sort of, here's a legal pad, go. But eventually things got better, and eventually I learned how to do this. And so that became a heavy part of my representation. Now, through the early 70s, we had this director who I think died not too long ago, Michael Trister, who was sort of a genius. And by this I mean the state was against us. They didn't want us there. There were underlying elements that knew we were important, but officially we were not wanted. And like anything associated with civil rights, whether it was MACE, the health centers, legal services, anything, all the legal programs, you had to have an outside home base, so to speak. And even legal services here didn't have a recognized as legal services of Mississippi, and we had to have some connection through something, other connection through another connection, so that the state didn't have a direct impact on us. So knowing that the Congress people didn't like us, that the establishment didn't want us, Trista was super good at camouflaging a lot of what we did, so that we just do what we were supposed to do to help the community. And we did it. And I think the only time we were questioned was when we were, another worker and I were transporting some students from a black section of town to the white school, and our travel for that. They said we weren't supposed to do that. But all the other things we had done, none of it was questioned. So anyway, and like I said, in those days, legal services was pretty freewheeling. We could even do a criminal case if a judge appointed you. And we did a few kind of high-profile cases back then. But then we got away from that. We did do a lot of employment discrimination cases, which are very important to the face of Mississippi. Legal services was a program that put mothers on the Medicaid cards with their children. Now, initially, parents couldn't get Medicaid with their children. The children got Medicaid, and they were required to get it because the federal government said in 1970, everybody got to have Medicaid. So Mississippi was the last state that had it. And Trista had a special 2-day workshop, one for lawyers and one for support staff, to talk about the implications of Medicaid for everybody and what the Medicaid program meant in Mississippi, well, what it meant. And then we had to, then a legal services office filed a case to get the mother's names on the Medicaid card, and we were successful. And we did enough lawsuits with housing, welfare department things, and different other matters that eventually they sort of recognized us. You know, if we represented somebody, they recognized that we were on the other side, and they respected us. So I always appreciated those ties to the civil rights movement and the importance that legal services played in the lives of Mississippi and in improving the lives of Mississippians. Now, in the 1980s, there was a movement, I say, or a legislative movement to destroy us, to just wipe us off the face of the earth, or to do away with us. And at that time, Wilhelm Joseph, our director, shut the program down. And he said, we're not doing any cases. We got to fight for our lives, get out and get people to write letters to Jamie Whitten to vote to keep us in. And we did that. And I was pleasantly surprised. I had no problem going to many people that we had waited on, because I knew what they had done, what we had done for them, and they knew what we had done for them. And so we could comfortably go to the community that we had served, and they stepped up for us when we had stepped up for them. So those were some of the things that I can remember that stood out during our time with legal services. Of course, we had some interesting court cases, and then we just had different cases along the years. And I remember years later, I was in a disability case with a lawyer from another state, with a judge from another state, and he said, "You're from legal services?" And I said, "Yes," and he said, "Y'all do a really good job." So I appreciated that at that time legal services had a national reputation. And you can remember the time when that wasn't so. There was one case where two of the lawyers in our office, Vic McTeer and Willie Bailey and Johnny Walls, were suing the Greenwood Police Department over some stuff with this crazy lieutenant and a sergeant who threatened them and didn't let them see a client. And I had to serve the summons on the lieutenant and the sergeant, and they lived right next to each other. And so when I went to serve the summons, the first time I went, they weren't home. I got to serve it on their wives, and so I didn't have to deal with them. But then we had to change the deposition, and I had to go back. And so they were yelling at me, and I was running. And so I was glad that I didn't have to do that again. And a few years later, I was working on a campaign for one of the lawyers who had left legal services, but I'd taken a day off, and I was working on the polls or something like that. And that sergeant was sitting there, and you look familiar. And I said to myself, I am familiar, but I didn't help him out. And I just let him go on and try to, where have I seen you before? And I'm going, in your driveway. But so there were little things like that. I guess there were a few times where things were a little bit dangerous in the early days, but they settled down. Eventually we didn't have to worry about these things. And then we had, even the director of the food stamp office in Sunflower County called us sort of off the record and said, and what Margaret said was completely right, and all this sort of thing. So, we got sort of backdoor help sometimes. But over the years, one of the things that struck me in Mississippi was lack of income. If you come from Marin County, California, and you come to Indianola, Mississippi, you don't understand what poor is. And then you all of a sudden do. So it always seemed to me very sensible that one thing that makes a big difference is trying to help people get on disability when they need it. Because there are, in those days, and even now really, your choices were you work hard. If you don't have a good education or you don't have a skill, you work really hard. Even though I know that's not the disability standard, if you can't do that, and the number of people who've ruined their health breathing pesticides and out in the fields all day in the hot sun and all this sort of thing is kind of incredible. People my age dragging around oxygen tanks and walkers and that sort of thing is commonplace. But anyway, so I did like the area of disability representation and the disability law, so with Social Security. So I did stick with that. And in terms of legal services, I got to see the beginning of the SSI program, which did away with the welfare disability program. So just to give you a perspective of how things have changed a little bit, a minimum payment from the welfare department for a mother with a child or a disabled person in the early 70s in Mississippi was $30. So things have changed a little bit. Your first SSI check was $90, and people just thought that was incredible. And of course now it's $771, which isn't enough to actually live, but if you work it right and get enough subsidized services, you can make it. But anyway, so that's what I continue to work on in legal services with disability. And as I said again, I appreciate the roots of legal services.
So looking back at when you first arrived in Mississippi, how did you find out about legal services from all the way over in California?
Well, legal services didn't really come into being for, I think this program started in the late 60s, and I was in the Delta. There was no legal services there. The legal services program started in Greenwood in the Delta. That was your first and only office at the time. It started in Greenwood in, I want to say, just a few months before I got in it, during '69. And so I was almost invited into it. And there was a law student there was Alex, who was from Greenwood. Alex Sanders died not too many months ago. And then there was a lawyer from John McCready from Ohio or Illinois, I think Illinois. And then there was a law student from Harvard and myself. And there were 2 secretaries from Greenwood. And so that was your office in Greenwood. And then eventually they hired more support staff for people who, paralegals like myself, who represented clients and interviewed them and did different kinds of work.
Now, in a short bio that you provide for us, you said that you remember you used to be by Fannie Lou Hamer?
Oh, yeah. She was in Sunflower County where I was. I knew her. I've been to her house more than once. I visited her house before she had a good house, when she had a tin tub on the porch. And, but she was from a plantation out from Ruleville. And then when she had registered to vote, she had been kicked off the plantation. So she moved to town, and then eventually her family finished getting the crop in, and they joined her. So she was very important politically. She got into SNCC in the early 60s, which was really, really dangerous. It was literally, I mean, people were riding by your house, shooting through your house almost every night in Ruleville at one time. And so they were trying to get people into Indianola, get a foothold there. That was the county seat. So they would be driving people from Ruleville to Indianola to register to vote. They couldn't do anything with anybody in Indianola. And finally they did. The 65 Summer Project was opening up. Mrs. Hamer was one of the ones that pushed for it. They had a worker there from Washington, D.C., named Charlie Cobb, which if you do some reading, his books are very good. But anyway, Charlie Cobb was an outside person who was working in Ruleville with Charles McLaurin and Mrs. Hamer in Ruleville. And you remember the philosophy of SNCC was you come in, you don't run things, you get people there to run things. And so Mrs. Hamer was their person. And she was the one that, led things, led community meetings, encouraged people to register to vote, went to out-of-state meetings. And and she was a named plaintiff when they started filing lawsuits, because it was a lawsuit against the Sunflower County Election Commission, I think, back in the later 60s, that laid the foundation for new elections in Sunflower County. Now, the Voting Rights Act passed in 65. It really wasn't recognized by the clerk. It was early 65, and it was late in 65 when we got a new circuit clerk before there was any acknowledgement that we had such a thing. Back in those days, we were bringing 6 people to the courthouse at a time, and we were lucky if one passed. They had a test. And so Mrs. Hamer, and she had done another thing very smart. She noticed that she said, with all these dogs and guns at the courthouse, there's something to this voter registration. And so she, that was important to her. And so she started paying her poll tax 2 years before she actually got registered, because they said before you could actually vote, you have to pay your poll tax. Paid it. So it took her a while to register, but she got registered. But by the time she registered, her poll tax was up to date. So eventually that got cut out, but that was something you had to pay in the early 60s. And so then once you got registered, which after a while people were getting registered, you didn't get to vote. The person over the polls didn't let you vote. So there were a lot of things with getting poll watchers and getting allowed to have poll watchers there to watch everything inside the polling place. And so I was a poll watcher one time, and witnessed all the voting from 6 to 6 or 6 to 8, I think it was then. So anyway, there were a lot. She was instrumental in that. But I was in the same county with Mrs. Hamer. She was in North Sunflower County, and I was in South Sunflower County. But of course, I went to her house, and we were all with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, so we all would go to meetings together. And when we had things where we were trying to get recognized by the National Democratic Party, we elected her as our committee woman. So she was an important part of Sunflower County and Sunflower County politics and the Sunflower County Civil Rights Movement.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party?
Well, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was started in Jackson, I believe, and Lawrence Guyot was their first chairman of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And so they were important in organizing things such as the challenge of the seating of the delegates from Mississippi to the Democratic Convention. And they weren't successful the first time they went, but they were the second time. Guyot couldn't go with them to that first trip because he was had been bonded out of jail, and it would have broken his probation, and somebody would have lost their property or their money putting it up for him. So he didn't go, but the people who went seemed to have been very well prepared, and as we know, Mrs. Hamer kind of put us on the map, so to speak. So anyway, everybody knew what had happened, and even though we weren't successful that time, we were the next time. And so and Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was key in that, in getting their way and getting who they wanted in place to represent the Democratic Party in Mississippi.
So it was challenging trying to get to that point.
Yes.
As you're saying, who would you say provided most of the challenge? Was it like the public itself, or was it more so the government?
It was the, I don't know if it's appropriate to use it, but I think it is, the power structure. The people who were in office and the people behind them. I mean, the people who really ran things. I mean, in a town like Sunflower, the mayor had an 8th grade education. He didn't know anything. But the chief of police, who was kind of strange, but he ran a lot of things, pretended like he didn't, but he did. And then he was on the board of aldermen, but the pharmacist, the local pharmacist in Sunflower, Joel Parker, he really ran things. He was smart and devious, but he ran things. So the power structure was very much against what we were doing. And we would do things like we'd put people on ballots to run them as independent candidates, because that was the only way we'd get them on the ballot. And so you have to have a petition with so many names on it, and to get the person's name on the ballot. So then there was a process where you went to the chairman of the Democratic Party, or as the chairman of something, I don't know, I just remember his old Mr. Townsend. He was, I'm against what you're doing. So there was that. But there was a force against you. Now, another thing to remember about Sunflower County back in those days, we didn't have dials on the telephone. And some places you actually had an old thing where you rang up the phone, like you see on old 30s movies. That's the kind of phones we had. But even in places where it was a little bit more sophisticated looking, you went through an operator, and you knew they were listening to you. And I think it was the last night of the operated services, and we were raising money for the Freedom School that we never replaced, but we tried. And Otis said something on the phone about we were aggravating the operator, and the phone started ringing. So we knew they were listening to us. So, and that, as far as spying on you and noticing what you were doing all the time, we knew that. And that was something that struck me. There were 3 things, the wages, health, people in their 40s taking all this medicine just to stay alive. And the other thing that was kind of shocking to me, because this was the United States of America, and I was from Mill Valley in San Francisco, and we did what we wanted to do, and some things we shouldn't do. and nobody bothered us. And I felt like I was in kind of a fascist state. You know, I felt like I was really being watched, and they tried to control, and you had to work under those auspices. Also, though, you have to keep in mind that you had some people near the power structure who didn't agree with everything. And that's probably what kept some of us alive, because I know Otis said every once in a while he'd get these anonymous phone calls that would say, you don't need to go down such and such a street, they're looking for you or waiting for you, and he wouldn't go. And so, you know, now we're all, you know, we all got through all of that. So anyway, those are how things were in the 60s and early 70s.
And so you said that's some of the things they did with like Mr. Otis, but did anyone like threaten you in any way? Did anyone approach you in kind of a wrong way?
On an isolated situation, I mean, I remember one man saying, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Oh, you're from California." He said, "If you were here, from here, we would handle you, you know, but in other words, we know what's wrong with you now, you know," so they didn't bother me. There were things where I knew I had to be careful. I wasn't going to do anything real stupid or just do something to be doing it. You know, people knew where you were. You usually went someplace with someone else. You kind of kept up with each other. But one or two direct threats. I mean, one time I did, when I first got there, I made a mistake and went down the wrong street. And he told me in no uncertain terms to go back where I came from, which I didn't know where that was, but I figured it out. But anyway, and they would do little things like, I mean, I helped do guard duty, so, you know, we were aware of that buildings where you kept things and had your meetings or your records could be bombed. And we had this office that was kind of in a little dead-end road, so we would either be guarding in the office when we had enough people, or if we didn't, we'd just guard at this porch where we could look down that street. So they couldn't go down that street without being seen. So they did throw a bomb from over a street over a house, and it just went in a parking lot. It didn't bother anything, and they couldn't see what they were doing. But they did try to throw a bomb over there.
What happened after that?
Nothing. I mean, they just throw a bomb that's made with a Coke bottle from the country club. You know, you just stay there with your gun.
So can you elaborate a little bit about some of the cases you took when you were working for legal services?
Okay. Well, I told you about the case with it was actually a police brutality case with against the city of Greenville that actually worked out, but and that was the one where I served the sergeants. I guess they were kind of, you know, they were kind of ugly with me, the lieutenant and the sergeant. So they did have, I mean, the city had to pay. So and there was a group of attorneys who worked on that from legal services. When that case was settled, some of them left the program at that time. So after that, trying to think, I know we're talking about this now because they're going to have a reunion about it in Shaw, but we did equalization of municipal services cases. The services that were provided to the black part of town and the white part of town were different or non-existent in the black part of town. You had houses with limited plumbing, sometimes pumps, a lot of people with old pumps, and but you had, or else if you had any inside plumbing, it was just a sink. You didn't have a bathtub or anything like this. And then the drainage and the sewage systems were limited in the black part of town. The streets were often not paved. No drainage system. Strange. Well, it's just different. No regular garbage system. You'd burn your garbage in a barrel in the front, and every once in a while a garbage can might come and pick something up. But essentially you couldn't depend on that. There's no such thing as garbage picked up every Tuesday. So there was the Shaw case, which was filed in the 60s, which took about 4 years but was successful, was a case where they challenged it. And I think it went to an appeal and came back, but anyway, eventually it was settled, where they had to spend money on the black part of town to bring it up to the level of the white part of town before they could spend any more money on the white part of town. So it did make some changes. And just to give you an example of how they didn't do anything in the black part of town, during the first year I was there in Indianola, a dog died, and it was left in the middle of the street, on a main street in the black part of Indianola. And it was just left there. And it was a big dog. And it really smelled awful. It got to the place where you couldn't even go down that street anymore. And, the city didn't do anything. Now that doesn't happen on any part of town. But that was something that you had to deal with. So anyway, that particular case in Shaw had kind of set the foundation. And so a lawyer from this office, I think he started in Greenwood, David Lipman, did that case where they challenged that, and they filed those lawsuits. They did one in Sunflower Town, and then they did them through a lot of once they got that one, then they did them throughout our service area, North Mississippi Rural Legal Services. And I helped take people around and count fire hydrants and street lights and that sort of and that sort of thing, so you could show the difference from the black part of town and the white part of town. And eventually they got a little bit of paving, which was remarkable in the town of Sunflower, because there was no paved streets in the black part of town initially. So that was a case Legal Services did. It provided a lot of benefit. Let's see. And that was one I helped work on and help find people. Then there was another case we did. Well, we did more than one with this. We did some consumer cases with unfair lending practices and not honoring that 3-day notice. We did that. We took one of those to federal court and was successful, and kind of taught a few of these loan companies that, yes, if you get somebody to put up their property, you have to give them that 3-day notice, or they don't have a perfected interest in your property. So we did that. We made a difference with that one. So we did quite a few housing cases and we straightened out quite a bit of property, because there were some grants that were available for people to fix their houses or replace their houses. And you couldn't get those if you didn't have clear title to your house. So Legal Services did a lot with helping people clean up their title. That was the first and only time I've seen a partition sale, but it worked, where they made this cousin who thought that this falling down house was somehow, he couldn't part with it. And then when he found out he had to make, if he was going to get his part from the sale, he had to compensate his cousin that had been in the house paying the taxes for doing this. And so I think he got $250 out of it. She got her house replaced. So there were different cases like that we worked on. But I do remember some of the consumer cases that we did that were kind of important. That you need to do cases like that, and then once the loan companies and the loan sharks and people understand that these exist, then you don't have that same problem as much.
And this kind of goes back to what you talked about with low income.
Yes.
And so personally, like as you were taking some of these cases and you saw like some of the conditions that some people lived in, whether, like you said, the black side of town versus the white side of town, what were some examples that you saw, like in terms of like low income or where these people have lived at? Could you describe
well,
that?
You have to remember, I always lived in the black part of town, and when you were in the early days of the Civil Rights Movement, you lived with families that you were working with. And it was a policy, I think, came from Ella Baker, where you go to the poor folks. These are people going to support you. These are the people going to do something. Leave the middle class people alone. And even though, hey, who has a bathtub? That type of thing. You didn't worry about that. You lived in the poor part of town. So I saw the conditions all the time until, things kind of eventually got better, including where I lived, and better housing was being built and people could buy them.
What were some of the things you saw?
Like, you mean the,
Like, let's say their housing conditions. What were some of the housing conditions?
Well, you had, there were wooden houses. As I said, limited plumbing. Well, I visited some friends out in the country. In fact, I spent the night there. The house was real nice in the house, except it was an outhouse way in the back. And they were kind of built. He was a carpenter, and so he built on the house when he had time. He was working full time, but when he wasn't working, he and his sons would add another room. And so the house was pretty good, getting to be pretty good sized. But you had a lot of space heaters. Occasionally you have a wood heater, and that would be all. That would be mostly out in the country. There was a good sized flood in the early 70s. I think that was 73. Kind of wiped out a lot of the country living. I mean, people were picked up in boats and they did not go back. And sometimes the house didn't make it either. So that kind of changed a lot of country living. And then there was a pretty bad tornado in 71. It wiped out a lot of country housing, and it was not replaced. So that was another thing Legal Services did. We did have a meeting where we helped with some of the relief efforts with the 70. We got some funding for it. We got some attorneys to come and help us do stuff. When we had those real bad tornadoes in 71, I can't remember if we got money with the floods, but I think we got a little bit of relief or some kind of outside relief that we assisted with. So these are things that kind of sort of changed sort of the complexion of some of the Delta. But you did have some pretty rough houses or housing situations. People did raise some of their own food. There were no food stamps when I first got here. That was a deal that came along later in the later 1960s. But you got commodities once a month, and they were kind of the lowest grade of food left. That's what commodities were. You had to be pretty creative to make them taste right. So anyway, the living situations of the way people had to live to get by were pretty difficult. And I think that's some of the problems with people's health is, if you're working in a field, you're going to have some stage plank and bologna in a pot. And after you've been working in the sun all day, that's not the best meal. People did cook a lot of vegetables that were pretty good, but getting food was sometimes kind of difficult. And you have to also keep in mind there were a lot of people who, and this is where Legal Services was helpful, there were a lot of people who took advantage of people's situations as far as getting them caught up in credit for things they couldn't afford. You had a lot of peddlers that would come in selling different stuff, and I remember sitting in somebody's front room and he's, "Oh no, that's the candy man," and they went and hid under their bed. A man is collecting for some candy that he sold him the month before. It's that sort of thing. There are a lot of people selling things off trucks and getting people stuck in credit situations.
What was your approach to that?
Trying to tell people not to do that or not to get in those. When we had, back in those days, we had community meetings, and I would try to give consumer advice about how not to do these things and the best way to buy things and best way to purchase things. And when I didn't drive then, but Otis would sometimes try to help people go to a bigger town to go to a supermarket and buy things at a good price, because people out in these smaller towns were stuck with these small stores that had pretty exorbitant rates. People had to live by credit.
And despite all the changes you guys were making and all the milestones you're reaching, you said that in the 80s there was a big movement to try to shut legal services down.
Well, see, you have to remember who appreciated us. And I don't want to say that we did this gargantuan improvements, but we made our part. We contributed, and things are somewhat better then than they are now. Some of the housing situations, you just can't live that way anymore. I had, in fact, in my last 6 years of I still do disability cases, so I meet with disability clients, and some of them live in some pretty difficult situations. And I have had 1 or 2 homeless, 3 or 4 homeless, which is always difficult. But when I say homeless, I mean homeless. But I had one client that lived in a house that was sort of out of the eye. It didn't meet any specifications or standards or anything like that. I mean, there's no way that this house could, if the housing inspector saw it, that's it. And this kind of house where when they tried to cut the lights on, something had some sparks, so they had to cook on a grill outside. But at least they had a grill. But as soon as he got his disability, they got out of that house. But ordinarily, you just can't live in a house like that. I mean, the city inspectors will shut them down, or not let you continue to rent them. But you have to have to appreciate that our efforts were not appreciated by everybody. We were looked at as radicals and messing with things, and everybody was happy before we got there. I mean, that was something they tried to tell us in the early days of the Civil Rights Movement. Of course, people did tell them off and say, that wasn't so, but they were trying to say that, we're perfectly happy before you came along. Of course, the people who we were working with told me a different version, but they knew their wages had gone up and everything had changed for the better as far as they were concerned. But we were not appreciated by the powers that be until, I'd say, 2000s, if you want to know the truth. A difference could be when we had a reunion. I'm with the civil rights organizations with Sunflower County and with the state of Mississippi. And so one of the things that we sponsored, or Miss Palmer did, was the return of the Freedom Riders. And so we're talking about 40 years later, and they remember when they were met by Ross Barnett and taken from the Greyhound bus to the bus to Parchment. So they didn't have any violence or anything like that, burning things like they did in Alabama. Just from this bus to that bus, bye. And so those people went to Parchment. And so she remembered, one of the people was remembering this when they came back. Here's Haley Barber sponsoring it. So it was pretty different. And, we have a banquet and you guests of honor and all this sort of thing. So it had changed in those years. And I have numerous disagreements with, although right now he looks like a paragon of virtue next to what we got now. But Haley Barber was instrumental. I wouldn't say the main one, but he had a whole lot to do with us having a civil rights museum.
What are some of the reasons that you think maybe he had a different point of view versus the people before?
Well, part of it was people working on him, and he listened. And then some people want to be on the right side of history, and that was part of it. And he went to Alabama, and he said, well, they have a beautiful museum, civil rights museum. Why can't we have one? Well, our museum kicks their museum's ass.
So comparing the changes that have been made from when you first started, if legal services didn't exist,
Mm-hmm.
how different do you think the community would be today?
Oh, very different. Nobody else was able to carry on the class actions that we did that made differences. Now, some differences didn't come out the way you wanted to, such as with the schools. We have a very substantial private school movement where essentially many school districts, the whites have just abandoned the school system, which makes problems. But initially, you had 2 school systems. Now you essentially have one. one public school system. I don't know how long that would have been taken to dismantle. If you're waiting on government lawyers to do all of the, there were some people with the Civil Rights Commission that did a few cases, but for the most part, of the Justice Department. But it was a slow, difficult process, and it was very hard to get. Even the Justice Department couldn't get the money they needed to fight the cases that they were fighting. So legal services intervened in a lot of cases that they were doing and worked with them. So it was giving more legal resources to help make changes and to file cases that needed to be filed. So progress would have been much slower. I don't recall anybody else doing anything on the consumer front but legal services. By that time, nobody else was doing anything. The lawyers with the Labor Department probably could have helped some of the unfair labor practices. And at one time, you did have pretty good people in those offices to help enforce wage and hour laws. That was another thing legal services got good at, of course, making connections with these different agencies and getting to know who could do what. I had people I could call in the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Atlanta that were very, very helpful when the food stamp office was beyond my control. And eventually it got to the place, too, where I could call people in Jackson and get stuff done. You know, if I was having a lot of problems with a local food stamp office worker, I had one when I got finished with her. She came to the person's house at lunchtime and told him to come on back and get it straight. So I think that was part of legal services, of making your contacts, knowing who to call and who to talk to get things done. I personally wasn't too crazy about food stamp hearings because you're talking about somebody trying to eat. You don't have 6 weeks to wait on a hearing and then wait on a decision that you might lose. So I tended to try to work things a little faster. So that was part of what legal services did. We don't have the best programs in those areas anymore, but I think more the welfare departments do a better job of doing their job than they used to do then. They were antagonistic. I mean, they were just hired for a job. Very few of them were interested in their cases or getting their work done or seeing people get benefits that they needed. So I think legal services played a part in that. You know, we filed a suit about discrimination with workers. They wouldn't hire any black workers. We got the first black workers in. So in terms of things that legal services did, it sort of laid a foundation where a lot of things can kind of cruise on their own now. You know, it's nothing for us to send a certain number of black legislators and black supervisors. And, we worked so hard to get the first black supervisor. And you have black mayors all over the place. And so you have a lot of black office holders. We wouldn't have had these things if legal services hadn't filed some of the cases that they did and worked on them and sometimes appealed them pretty far. So a lot of things in education and in, like I said, consumer law. I don't know anybody else who was doing it. And we did it, and we did it well.
Do you have anything else you'd like to say?
Only that I'm always grateful for legal services because it kind of kept my life complete. It, kept my connections to the civil rights movement. I was still doing what I believed in, and then it gave me something to keep on doing. So I'm still doing disability cases. And so I'm thankful for the connection that legal services gave me to, allowed me to keep doing what I thought was important and allowed me to continue to do a life of service.